The shock was not that Harry asked for help. The shock was that the palace allegedly decided the plea itself was the final red flag, and what happened next was not a bailout, not a quiet father-son rescue, not even one last royal safety net whispered into existence behind velvet curtains, but a private financial audit ordered at the highest level after insiders say Charles realized the crisis was far worse than anyone around him had admitted, because this was never just about money, was it? Money was only the smoke. The real fire was trust. The real scandal was the fear spreading behind palace walls that Harry had crossed from emotional pressure into financial desperation, and once that suspicion entered the room, everything changed. Suddenly, the missed deadline was no longer being treated like a family disappointment. It was being treated like evidence. Evidence that the promises had failed, the timeline had collapsed, and the numbers behind the California image might be more dangerous than the palace had been led to believe. And when that kind of fear reaches Charles, the man does not shout. He does something colder. He verifies. So the story moving through private circles was explosive. After Harry returned without meeting the condition that had allegedly been placed in front of him, Charles did not simply say no and move on. He reportedly demanded a discreet financial review of Harry's entire position, not just what Harry chose to show him in that tense meeting, but everything that might be hiding underneath it. Debts, liabilities, legal exposure, business losses, inventory burdens, tax pressure, outstanding private obligations. The sort of audit nobody asks for unless they suspect the visible problem is only a polished version of the real one. And that was the tremor running through the story. The palace was no longer reacting emotionally, it was investigating structurally. That refusal was brutal enough on its own, but insiders say the true aftershock came after the door closed. Because Charles, according to the leak, was less disturbed by the request than by the shape of it. The list, the urgency, the timing, the fact that Harry had allegedly arrived having already burned through personal reserves just to make the trip. It painted a picture too reckless to ignore and too unstable to reward. And once advisors began lining up the numbers being whispered in briefing rooms, the feeling hardened into something darker. What if this was not a temporary shortfall, but a full collapse in slow motion, dressed up as a rescue request? That is when William's shadow reportedly fell across the entire discussion. Not because he needed to be loud, but because his argument was the one nobody in that room could easily dismiss. If Harry could not meet the deadline, if he could not separate personal decisions from institutional consequences, if he could not guarantee that any agreement made in London would hold once he returned to California, then no financial intervention could be considered safe. Safe for the crown, safe for the family, safe for the future headlines, because an uncontrolled crisis with palace money attached to it would no longer be Harry's problem. It would become the monarchy's humiliation. And that is where this story turned vicious. Because once the possibility of a private audit entered the scene, every glamorous surface began to look suspicious. The brand partnerships did not look like security, they looked like unstable scaffolding. The public appearances did not look like relevance, they looked like maintenance. The lifestyle did not look aspirational, it looked expensive. Very expensive. The kind of expensive that stops being impressive the second real accountants start asking quiet questions in closed rooms. Insiders say Charles wanted to know what was owed, what was pledged, what was overstated, what was delayed, and what future disasters might be heading straight toward the family crest if he made even the smallest move in Harry's favor. And Harry, according to the whispers, felt that shift instantly. The atmosphere was no longer father and son, it was monarch and liability. He had come hoping emotion might reopen a locked door, but instead he may have triggered the one response he could not control. Scrutiny. Real scrutiny. Palace-level scrutiny. The kind that does not care about wounded feelings, television interviews, public sympathy, or carefully staged narratives about reinvention. Numbers do not bend for emotion. Numbers do not soften because someone feels rejected. Numbers expose. They strip stories bare. They turn slogans into deficits. They turn image into evidence. And then came the whisper that made the whole thing even uglier. Some insiders allegedly believe the audit was not only about Harry's finances, but about whether outside influence had compromised his judgment so badly that he was no longer operating independently at all. That is the kind of palace suspicion that burns for years. Because once advisors begin wondering whether Harry is speaking for himself or for a failing machine around him, every future conversation becomes contaminated. Every plea sounds scripted. Every promise sounds temporary. Every reconciliation offer sounds transactional. By then, Charles was said to be looking at the situation with chilling simplicity. If Harry missed the deadline, then emotion had already failed. If the request came wrapped in pressure, then trust had already failed. And if the finances were messier than disclosed, then the final illusion had failed too. What remained was the raw question no one wanted to say aloud: was Harry asking for help help, or was he dragging the palace toward the edge of his own financial cliff? That question hung over everything, and by the time the evening settled over London, people inside those walls were no longer talking about rescue. They were talking about containment. They were talking about exposure. They were talking about what else might surface if the books were opened even a crack. Because if Charles truly ordered that private audit after the deadline shock, then this was not a family spat anymore. This was the moment the crown stopped seeing Harry as a wounded prince asking to come in from the storm and started seeing him as a crisis file that had to be measured before it could explode. And what made the situation even more dangerous was not just the possibility that the numbers were worse than expected, but the speed at which everything seemed to be unraveling once that invisible line had been crossed. Because insiders began hinting that once the audit conversation started, it did not stay contained inside one room or one meeting. It spread quietly, carefully, through legal advisors, financial analysts, senior aides who had seen crises before and recognized the pattern immediately. The pattern of a structure that had held together just long enough to appear stable, but underneath it was already cracking in multiple places at once. And suddenly, every piece of information that had previously been dismissed as rumor began to feel like a clue. The expiring deals, the unsold inventory, the legal costs stacking up in the background, the tax pressures that did not go away just because they were inconvenient. It all started to form a picture that was no longer speculative. It was cumulative. And that is what made it so alarming for Charles. Not one single problem, but a chain reaction where every issue fed into the next, amplifying it, accelerating it, making it harder to isolate or fix without pulling the entire structure apart. Because from the palace perspective, this no longer looked like a son who needed temporary help. It looked like a system that had been running on momentum and image rather than sustainable ground. And once that realization took hold, the conversation changed again. It was no longer about whether to help Harry, it was about whether helping him would pull the institution into the same downward spiral. Because any financial involvement would not just solve a problem, it would attach the crown's credibility to whatever came next. And if what came next was worse, if the audit revealed deeper instability, then the palace would not just be involved, it would be responsible in the eyes of the world. That is why the silence that followed was so loud. No softening statements, no carefully worded reassurances, no symbolic gestures designed to suggest that something was still being worked out behind closed doors. Just distance. Cold, deliberate distance. The kind that signals a decision has already been made even if it has not been publicly announced. And for Harry, that silence may have been more devastating than any outright rejection, because rejection at least gives you something to argue against. Silence leaves you alone with the consequences. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the pressure was not waiting. It was building. The kind of pressure that does not knock politely but arrives in waves. Financial obligations that do not pause. Expectations that do not shrink just because reality has changed. A lifestyle that continues demanding the same level of output even when the engine behind it is starting to stall. And inside that environment, the cracks do not stay hidden for long. They show up in conversations, in decisions, in the way people react when options start disappearing one by one. And then came the moment that, according to those watching closely, confirmed the palace's worst fears. The public misstep that reignited everything. The reminder that control over the narrative was slipping, not stabilizing. Because if the audit was meant to test whether Harry could contain the situation, what followed suggested the opposite. That even as the stakes escalated, the same patterns were repeating. The same risks being taken. The same signals being sent that nothing fundamental had changed. That is when the conversation inside palace circles reportedly hardened for good, because it was no longer theoretical. The evidence was no longer hypothetical. It was playing out in real time. And for Charles, who had already drawn a line with that deadline, this was the confirmation he needed that crossing that line again would not fix anything. It would only delay the inevitable while making the fallout larger when it finally arrived. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Harry was left in the most difficult position of all. Not because he did not understand what was happening, but because he did. Because he could see the doors closing one after another. He could feel the shift from concern to calculation, from family to institution, from emotion to assessment. And once that shift happens inside a structure like the monarchy, it does not reverse easily. It locks into place. It becomes policy. It becomes precedent. It becomes something much harder to fight than a single decision. The argument that followed behind closed doors was not just about money anymore. It was about direction, about who had led who grew into this position, about whether the path they had taken was ever sustainable or whether it had always been a gamble that finally ran out of time. And those are not arguments that resolve quickly. They dig deeper. They expose more. They force truths out into the open that had been avoided for too long. And that is where the real weight of this story settles. Not in the headline about an audit, not in the whispers about a missed deadline, but in what those things represent. A breaking point, a moment where the illusion of endless options disappears and what remains is a set of consequences that cannot be pushed aside any longer. Because if Charles truly ordered that private audit, then he was not just reacting to a request. He was preparing for what comes after the request fails. And what comes after is always the part nobody prepares for. The part where the narrative no longer belongs to you, where the story is no longer about what you intended but about what actually happened, where every decision is measured not by how it felt at the time, but by what it produced in the end. And in that space, there are no shortcuts, no sudden reversals, no last-minute rescues that erase everything that came before. Because the truth is, once an institution like that decides to step back, it does not rush forward again. It waits, it observes, it lets events unfold until the outcome is undeniable. And by the time that outcome arrives, it is usually too late to change it.